Items regarding the class that I just want to address before we get rolling with the contents of the lesson. The first thing is, this is our third class in class, but if you look online at YouTube and the church website, you're going to see 4 classes listed. Okay, so this is numbered number 4. The reason for that is because if you recall back to the first week, there was a whole section of the notes that I didn't have time to get to. And so Nate and I recorded a separate standalone conversation on that part of the notes that we've made number 2. So this lesson right now is number 4 if you're looking at the numbering system on YouTube or the church's website. That being said, the other thing I want to mention is Nate and I have talked about it, and we have decided that we are going to follow very closely the curriculum book that we bought. We'll be bringing in some other things, but the first 2 lessons, the one I taught 2 weeks ago and the one Nate taught, we kind of grabbed from a lot of different stuff and kind of wrote our own lessons. And what we decided to do is to follow that in case one of you wants to pick that up or somebody wants to do something similar, maybe in their own church or whatever, that things are kind of guided in that way. And thirdly, we've discussed kind of changing the notes a little bit. So I'm experimenting with that here today, where the notes are going to be a little bit more interactive. There's going to be some stuff for you guys to kind of fill out if you choose to as we go through here. I have embedded 2 videos in the PowerPoint for today's lesson. I've left spaces and blanks for if you want to jot anything down regarding those videos when we get to that point. So we're just trying to experiment with a couple different things here. Any page numbers on quotes or whatever, those are all related to the curriculum book that we're following. So Nate, is there anything you think I should add to that?
No, I think that covers everything.
Okay. All right, so lesson 4 in the numbering is titled The Branches of Logic, Terms, and Types of Definitions. So we're going to be trying to get through 3 things today. We're going to talk about branches of logic, the importance of defining terms, and then looking at different types of definitions, probably talking through some examples, etc. Okay? So let's start by talking about the branches of logic. Now, I gave you this in your notes. So we start with just what we would call logic at the top. Okay? And from there, logic does branch out into 2 different types of logic, what we would call informal logic and formal logic. So we have sort of a tree here that's sort of breaking things down, all right? On the informal side of the tree, we have what are called terms. We're going to be talking about that. It's going to be one of our main points this morning to talk about the importance of defining terms, why that's so critical in conversations. Then you have statements. Statements are generally made regarding terms. You use terms to make statements. And then we'll discuss briefly today, more detail later on, some informal fallacies related to informal logic. Okay? Then on the other side of this, we've got formal logic. And there's generally 2 types, although there are more than 2, but we're not really going to cover those. We're going to be looking at deduction in this class and induction in this class. And then under deductive logic, there are 2 different types. There's what we call categorical logic and presuppositional logic. And we'll be talking through what all these terms mean here shortly. But this is sort of the tree of logic, if you will, and how these things break down into different branches. So let's kind of talk through some of these terms here and understand what we're dealing with. All right? So first, formal logic. Formal logic deals directly with reasoning by considering the means of distinguishing between proper and improper modes of reasoning. Okay? We'll be looking at some examples of this here shortly as we look at some errors that people might make. But this is formal logic, improper versus proper modes of reasoning. All right? And we engage in proper or improper modes at any given point as we think through different things. All right? Second, we've got informal. All right? And informal deals with operations of thinking that are indirectly related to reasoning, such as defining terms, relating terms to each other, and determining relationships between terms. All right? Underneath that, we have informal fallacies. Informal fallacies are not formal methods of reasoning. They are included under the branch of logic. Okay, so I left some space for you to write some of these down if you want to. All right. One of them is ad hominem, or personal attacks. So you've all been online. You've all read comments on YouTube or Facebook or wherever it is, right? And are we struggling to see that down here?
A little bit.
Okay. Maybe we'll have to use a shorter pulpit next week. Okay. But ad hominem personal attacks. So this is the scenario where somebody says they're struggling to sort of defeat your argument, so they go to, or resort to something like, well, you're an idiot. Right? Or, well, I don't like the color of your shirt. Or you're arguing about, which sports team is better, and somebody's like, well, they've got dumb uniforms. Okay? All of that is what we might consider to be ad hominem, personal attacks. Okay? Things that are distracting from what the actual arguments are, and they are getting into personal. A second is what we call a straw man argument. You've all heard people refer to this. A straw man argument is where somebody sets up a false argument and they proceed to knock it down, right? So they misrepresent, they mischaracterize, they portray you as believing ABC when you don't really believe ABC, you believe XYZ, and then they set about to attack that argument. That's called a straw man. That is an informal fallacy. Another one is an appeal to authority, okay? Where you appeal to the authority. I see this sort of thing all the time. Well, I've studied XYZ for 40 hours, so I can't be wrong because I've studied it for this amount of time. One of my favorite appeals to authority is a conversation that happened at the Potsdam Conference after World War II, where Truman, because FDR has died, Truman, Stalin, and Churchill, they're sitting around talking about how they're going to divide up Europe after World War II, okay? And one of them brings up, I think it's Churchill brings up, and he says, well, the Pope thinks we should do this. And Stalin returns and he says, well, how big's the Pope's army? Okay, so it's a little bit of a joke there, but that could be an example of an appeal to authority, right? So the Pope can tell us to do whatever he wants, but unless he's prepared to enforce it, then we don't have to listen to it, okay? Another one would be false dilemma, or either-or fallacy, where something is portrayed as it either is all this way or all that way, when there could be some reality in the middle between the either-or that some people might decide to look at. And then another one is the slippery slope fallacy. If you embrace the premise, then, you're going to end up in absolute error and abject failure, okay? These are examples of informal fallacies. We'll be talking more about these specifically in future lessons, all right? Anybody have any questions about formal and informal logic? Now, these fallacies, you'll see people engage in these things routinely. I see this every week. Every week that somebody engages with me, I basically, on our church's YouTube page, I basically approve any comment that doesn't have profanity or sexually explicit stuff in it or something like that, regardless of whether I think it's a good comment or not. I approve it and I let the audience, decide whether people are crazy or not, okay? But you start reading some of the comments and you start realizing real fast, are people making all sorts of errors in the way they think about stuff, okay? So that brings us then to did you have a comment or question? The induction and deduction. Okay, let's talk about deduction first. Deduction deals with arguments that are valid or invalid. All right, this is important. Valid or invalid. If valid, the conclusion follows from the premises, and it does so with certainty. So in a deductive argument, we're dealing with, is the argument valid or invalid? And if the conclusion follows from the premises, then we would say that there's a certain element of what? Certainty in that type of an argument. A valid conclusion is one that is contained within the premises. If the premises of a valid argument are true, then the conclusion must be true. This is how deductive reasoning works. We'll look at a short video on this here shortly that's going to kind of break that down more clearly. Okay? Let me give you an example here. Premise 1. If it rains, the ground will be wet. How many think that's true? Okay. Premise 2. It's raining. Currently, it's raining. Obviously, it's not. You understand I'm using an example here, okay? Premise 2, it's raining. This is a fancy sign and logic for therefore. Therefore, the ground is wet. Okay? Well, let's look at this. If it rains, the ground is wet. Is that a true statement?
Yes.
Yes. Okay? For the sake of illustration, if it's currently raining, does it follow from the premises that the conclusion, the ground is wet, has to be true? There's no way around that, right? Because if it's raining, the ground's wet. It's raining, the ground's wet. It's obviously true. You don't need any further proof. You don't need any further discussion. It's obviously true. Okay, now this idea of, we'll see this in the video here in a minute, but this idea that the premises lead to the conclusion, this is called entailment. E-N-T-E-L-M-E-N-T. Entailment.
E-N-T-A-I-L-M-E-N-T.
Wait a minute. What is it?
Like a dogtail.
E-N-T-A-I-L.
Like entailment, okay.
M-E-N-T.
Entailment is when the premises follow and the conclusion fits, okay? Now, what I want to do is I want to look at this video, all right? Now, let me just say something about this. This is a video from a series of videos called Crash Course Philosophy. These are not done by Christians, okay? But this is a series of videos that I will use quite frequently in my philosophy class at school to talk about some of these basic concepts, okay? So we're going to look at two clips today. We're going to look at this one on how to argue philosophical reasoning. This is the first one. I might pause this a couple times, make some comments, solicit some engagement with what's being said. And you guys will notice on page 2 that I've left you some blanks should you decide you want to jot anything down regarding this video. So here's hoping this works. Come on.
And tomorrow you aren't the same person. If you're tired of what today you is doing, get an accounting fundamentals certificate from WGU School of Business and get a whole new tomorrow you in just 6 months. Enroll today at WGU.
Thank you.
Do they teach Latin?
When pre-planning a celebration of life, just knowing where to start can be the hardest part.
Hopefully this isn't like inappropriate.
With the simplicity,
Yeah, right.
professionalism, and peace of mind you deserve. More Dignity Memorial. Find us at dignitymemorial.ca.
Alright, here we go.
Crash Course Philosophy is brought to you by Squarespace. Squarespace. Share your passion with the world.
Aristotle once described humans as the rational animal. Well, actually, he said that man is the rational animal, but we don't have to be sexist just because he was. And if you've ever gotten into an argument with someone about religion or politics or which Hemsworth is the hottest, then you've experienced how irrational people can be about their opinions. So what Aristotle meant is that rationality is our distinguishing characteristic. It's what sets us apart from the beasts. And no matter how much you disagree with someone about God or Obama or Chris Hemsworth, you can at least grant that they are not beasts. Because most of the time, at least, people can be persuaded by arguments. You use arguments all the time. In the comments, at family dinners, with your friends. You probably just don't think of them the same way that philosophers do. When you try and convince your parents to loan you the car, or when you're talking up Crash Course to your friends, you are using arguments. Thanks, by the way. Each time you tell someone to do or believe something, or when you're explaining why you do or believe something, you are giving an argument. The problem is, the vast majority of people aren't really good at arguments. We tend to confuse making a good argument with, like, having witty comebacks, or just making your points more loudly and angrily, instead of building a case on a solid foundation of logic, which can be harder than it sounds. But learning about arguments and strong reasoning will not only make you a better philosopher, it will also set you up to be a more persuasive person. Someone who people will listen to. Someone who's convincing. So yeah, these skills are beneficial no matter what you want to do with your life, so you might as well know how to argue properly. If you want to learn how to argue, then you should probably probably start around 2,400 years ago when Plato was laying out how reason can and should function in the human mind. He believed that we all have what he called a tripartite soul, what you might think of as yourself or your psyche divided into three parts. First, there's the rational or logical part of the soul, which represents cool reason. This is the aspect of yourself that seeks the truth and is swayed by facts and arguments. When you decide to stop eating bacon for 2 meals a day because, as delicious as it is, it's bad for you, then you make that decision with the guidance of the rational part of your soul. But then there's the spirited aspect, often described as the emotional part of the self, although that doesn't really quite capture it. The spirited soul isn't just about feeling, it's also about how your feelings fuel your actions. It's the part that responds in righteous anger at injustice, the part that drives your ambition and calls upon you to protect others. It gives you a sense of honor and duty and is swayed by sympathy. So if you decide to stop eating bacon because you just finished reading Charlotte's Web and now you're in love with Wilbur, then you're being guided by the spirited part of your soul. But we share the next part of our soul with other animals, be they pig or moose or aardvark. The appetitive part is what drives you to eat, have sex, and protect yourself from danger. It is swayed by temptations that are carnal and visceral. So those times when you go ahead and just eat all the bacon because it just smells so dang good, the appetitive aspect of your soul is in control. Now, Plato believed that the best human beings, and I should point out here that Plato most definitely did believe that some people were better than others, are always ruled by the rational part of their soul because it works to keep the spirited and the appetitive parts in check. People who allow themselves to be ruled by their spirited or appetitive selves are base, he believed, and not fully, properly human. Now, most of us don't buy into the concept of the tripartite soul anymore, or the idea that some humans are less human than others. So we do understand that we're all motivated by physical desires, emotional impulses, and rational arguments. And philosophers continue to agree with Plato that reason should be in the driver's seat. So how do you know if you're good at it? How can you test your reasoning? Well, let's head over to the thought bubble for some flash philosophy.
Even though some things are far away, you plan for them ahead of time because they're important. When it comes to your celebration of life, it's really no different. You want to plan ahead now so your family doesn't have to later.
Well, apparently that's not going to work. I need to just jump into a video. But they get into, by the way, I don't agree with the tripartite thing. Okay, I believe man is a trichotomy, body, soul, spirit, soul, body, etc. Okay, but the point, if we would have gotten to it, and I might be able to find a different way to get to it, which I don't know if I want to waste time on, it would be getting into things related to deductive and inductive reasoning. Okay, Anybody got any questions or comments at this point?
Now, who is that guy?
That is a guy named Hank Green. He and his brother run that website. What's the name of that video? Philosophical How to Argue.
How to argue, philosophical reasoning, rational speaking.
It's the first time I've messed with that, so I do apologize. I think we can, and now we can skip ahead to what I want. All right, here we go.
Philosophers maintain that
if you're unsure or unaware of your eyeglass prescription, or if your prescription changes frequently,
your beliefs should always be backed up by reasons, which we call premises. Premises form the structure of your argument. They offer evidence for your belief, and you can have as many premises as you like as long as they support your conclusion, which is the thing that you actually believe. So let's dissect the anatomy of an argument. There are actually several different species of arguments. Probably the most familiar and the easiest to carry out is the deductive argument. The main rule of a deductive argument is if your premises are true, then your conclusion must be true. And knowing that something is actually true is very rare and awesome. So here's a boiled down version of the good deductive argument. Premise 1, all humans are mortal. Premise 2, Socrates is human. Conclusion, Socrates is mortal. This kind of reasoning.
Okay, so Nate covered this last time. This is deductive reasoning. Okay, premise 1, all humans are mortal. Is that true? Socrates is human. Is that true?
Yeah.
Therefore, Socrates is mortal. Does that have to be true? Does it follow from the premises in this deductive argument that that's true? Okay.
fact leads to another is called entailment. Once we know that all humans are mortal and that Socrates is human, those facts entail that Socrates is mortal. Deduction begins with the general, in this case what we know about human mortality, and reasons down to the specific, Socrates in particular. What's great about deductive arguments is that the truth of the premises must lead to the truth of the conclusion. When this happens, we say that the argument is valid. There's no way for the conclusion to be false if the premises are true. Now check out this argument. All humans are mortal, Socrates is a human, therefore Socrates was Plato's.
All humans are mortal. Still true? Yes. Socrates is a human. Still true? Socrates was Plato's teacher. Does the conclusion follow from the premises? No. Okay? It doesn't follow from the premises, right? So let's hear what he has to say about it.
That argument is invalid because nothing about human mortality can prove that Socrates was Plato's teacher. As you might have noticed, there are plenty of mortal humans who never taught Plato. What's interesting, though, is that this argument does happen to have a true conclusion, which leads us to another issue, and that is validity is not the same as truth. All valid really means is that if the premises are true, then your conclusion can't be false. But that doesn't mean that your premises prove your conclusion to be correct. Like in the case of whether Socrates was Plato's teacher, the premises are true and the conclusion is true, but the argument is still not valid because the premises don't in any way prove the conclusion. It just happens to be true. So if your premises don't guarantee the truth of your conclusion, then you can end up with some really crappy arguments, like this one. All cats are mammals. I'm a mammal, therefore I'm a cat. As much as...
Okay? Is it true that all cats are mammals? Yeah. Is it true that Hank Green is a mammal by biological definitions? Therefore he's a cat. Well, obviously, is that invalid? Is it true?
The first two are true.
What's that?
The first two are true.
The first two are true. Is the conclusion true? No.
We would like to be my cat. This is invalid because the conclusion doesn't entail from the premises at all. I mean, all cats are mammals, but all mammals aren't cats, which means there are such things as non-cat mammals, which I am just one example of. And it probably goes without saying, but you can have a perfectly valid argument and still have a false conclusion if any of your premises are false. For example, all humans have tails, my brother John is a human, therefore John Green has a tail.
All humans have tails. False. My brother John is a human.
True.
True. John Green has a tail.
No, false.
False.
But
Okay.
it's valid.
What?
But it's
It's valid, but it's not what? True.
Argument is totally valid because the premises entail the conclusion. The reasoning totally stands up. It's just that one of the premises is flawed. Since I'm reasonably certain that John doesn't have a tail, I've seen him in a bathing suit, this argument is not deductively sound. And a deductively sound argument is one that's free of formal flaws or defects. It's an argument whose premises are all true, and that's valid, which means its conclusion is guaranteed to be true. So, sound arguments should always be your goal. The reason that deduction is prized by philosophers and lots of other important kinds of thinkers is that it's the only kind of argument that can give you a real certainty. But it's limited, because it only works if you're starting with known true premises, which are hard to come by. And for what it's worth, deductive truths are usually pretty obvious. They don't tend to lead us to startling new information, like the fact that...
So, deductive truth is very important because assuming you have a valid argument and you have a true conclusion, does it have to be true? There's no way around that being the case, right? So let me get out of this and get back into the PowerPoint. Does anybody have any comments or questions? If you do, by all means, make sure you say so. Yeah?
What was the other, so instead of tripartite?
Tripartite?
Yeah, what's the other one you said?
So that's an idea that Plato had about how humans are structured. I think that I don't agree with that as a Bible-believing Christian. I believe in the idea that man is a trichotomy, that he has a spirit, soul, and a body. And we could get off into that pretty quick, but I don't necessarily agree with that Platonic idea from the way that the video talked about it, okay? So we got deduction. Talked about that, skipping the video. Induction. Induction deals with arguments, and this is important, of likelihood. No, go back. of likely... It's not going to let me underline, so apologize. Of likelihood and probability. By induction, we draw conclusions from facts or experience, conclusions which go beyond those facts. Inductive conclusions are never certain, but only probable. Okay? So deductive logic gives you certainty. Inductive logic leads to probability and what is most likely true or most likely the case given the set of facts that we're exploring in a given time. As such, they can be considered strong or weak depending on how well experience supports the conclusions. So getting out of this again, I want to hop into the next video, How to Argue, Part 3, and we want to look at induction, or deduction.
How a law for women over 50 should be.
Oh, YouTube.
Crash Course Philosophy is brought to you by Squarespace. Squarespace, share your passion.
I try to get fancy. Things don't work.
This is what research and development is for. Where's our R&D department?
With the world.
How do you know that aspirin will take care of your headache? Why do you really want to see that new Marvel movie, even though you haven't heard anything about it, good or bad? Your ability to do things like predict how a medication will affect you, or what movie you might like, or even things like what the perfect gift might be for your best friend, or what's the fastest way to get to campus. All of this stuff you know through induction. Deductive arguments are great because they give us certain answers. But unfortunately, much of the world cannot be summed up in a neat deductive proof. Deduction requires a fair amount of general information to give you a specific conclusion that is, frankly, probably kind of obvious. So philosophy, and basically, life as well, require that you have other ways of reasoning. In addition to knowing how one fact leads to another, you also need to take what you've experienced before and use that to predict what might happen in the future. And you need to be able to rule out what can't be true so you can focus on what can. Through these kinds of reasoning, you're not only able to figure out stuff like how to fix your headache and why your roommate might be acting weird, you can also come up with better, more skillful arguments and counter-arguments, which are some of the most important maneuvers in the philosophical game. And maybe the best part is, you already know how to use these techniques. In fact, I bet you've used them this very day. You know this. If you possess any ability to really predict the future, it lies in your ability to reason inductively. Inductive reasoning relies on the predictability of nature to reveal that the future is likely to resemble the past, often in important ways. For example, there's tons of research to support the knowledge that aspirin, acetylsalicylic acid, is an effective treatment for pain, like headaches. And you probably have personal experience with the effects of aspirin too. So you believe that this aspirin tablet will cure the headache you have right now because countless aspirin tablets have cured countless headaches in the past. Likewise, you want to see the new Marvel movie because you liked most of the other ones, so you believe that they'll continue to deliver for you entertainment-wise. But it's important to remember that unlike deduction, where true premises entail true conclusions, inductive premises only mean that the conclusion is likely to be true. Inductive arguments don't provide you with certainty. Instead, they work in terms of probabilities. And they're useful for more than just predicting what's going to happen. For example, most men in ancient Athens had beards. Socrates was a man who lived in ancient Athens. Therefore, Socrates probably had a beard. This is an inductive argument because it starts with what we already be for your best friend, or what's the fact.
Does everybody understand why that's inductive?
This is an inductive argument because it starts with what we already know about the grooming habits of ancient Athenian men and about the time and place in which Socrates lived, and makes an educated guess based on that information. There's no guarantee that the conclusion is correct, but what's known would seem to support it. Reasoning like this is incredibly useful, which is why it's so common, but there's also a problem. The future doesn't always resemble the past, and every pattern has its outliers. So induction always has the potential to produce false results. Aspirin might not work on a really bad headache, the new Marvel movie might be awful, and yeah, maybe a specific guy in Athens had a beard, but it's possible he didn't. While the world tends to work according to predictable rules, sometimes those rules are violated. And you know what you need when that happens? A little flash philosophy.
So does everybody understand the difference between induction and deduction? Induction is giving you, if it's set up and it's valid and it's a true conclusion, it's giving you certainty. Induction doesn't work that way, and there's always a certain level of uncertainty when we think about things being inductive. Nate, is there anything you want to add?
Yeah, I think the big one he hit on in the first video was that just because the conclusion is true doesn't mean we got there validly.
Yep.
And that one's a hard one. Brian and I are dealing with this right now, currently writing stuff for that. We agree with a conclusion, but how we got to that conclusion or how other individuals got to that conclusion is completely invalid or erroneous. So as Christians, we have to look at not only do we agree with these conclusions, but it's important how we got there. How did we reason to it? And so that's what I think that video is getting towards. Even with true premises and a true conclusion, it can still be invalid, or it could be invalid, meaning yes, the premises are true, yes, the conclusion is true, but how you got to your conclusion is flawed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Anybody got any comments or questions? What about, everybody understand the difference between deduction and induction? Okay? So I used an example the first week that would have fit this, right? So you and your roommate are both sick. You and your roommate both ate sushi for dinner. Therefore, you and your roommate ate bad sushi. Is that inductive or deductive?
Inductive.
Mike says inductive. Do you agree with that, Nate?
Yeah.
I think it's inductive as well. Okay. Why is it inductive? Because you're not well. The idea though is could there have been could you be sick because of something else?
Right.
You could be. Maybe you both caught the same neurovirus, or maybe you both it's probable, it's possible that the reason you're both sick is because you both ate the same sushi and it was bad. So we got to be really careful as we think through, how these arguments work and how they function. Yeah.
Would it be valid to say that fourth turning book they used inductive reasoning to predict the future?
I would say they are using past cycles to try to forecast what might occur. Yes, I would think that is a form of induction. Yeah, that's a good example.
To be kind of like speculative.
Yes, an educated speculation. Like he said right there. You get a headache, you take Advil. 9 times out of 10 does it work and your headache go away. Occasionally does it not work. So it's probabilities. It's based upon what I know in the past, based upon all the factors that I can look at. This is probably what will happen. That's induction. So induction always has a bit of I'm getting them confused. Deduction always has a bit of what's the word I'm looking for? Deduction is certainty, right? Induction is probability, is what I'm trying to say. I apologize for being unclear. Anybody else? Okay, categorical and propositional. Categorical logic deals with the syllogism, which is a type of deductive argument in which the conclusions connect one category or term with another, hence the name categorical logic. Okay, and we just saw some examples of that looking at the examples from the video. Whereas propositional logic connects entire propositions together in arguments. So there's some differences between these things in the way that you can use them to structure arguments. There's other ways of reasoning too. In the video he had that sort of pantheon's not the word I want. But he had that scope of different ways of arguing. There's another way of arguing called abduction, which is something different. We're not going to get into that. That you could argue that's the way that Sherlock Holmes goes about solving crimes, etc., is using a form of abduction. But the two most common ones that you're going to encounter the most often are induction, deduction, which are either categorical or propositional in the way they go about things. Okay? So this is, again, we've been talking about logic and the different branches. And I apologize. I'm sorry that the videos did not work the way that I set them up to work. And if this has been disjointed and clunky, I take responsibility for it. So, yeah, Blake?
I might have a way for you to be able to do the videos better so you can put them in your presentation better.
what I wanted to be able to do is just show the few spots, and obviously that didn't work the way I wanted to, so I apologize for that. So let's move on to terms. Okay? So a term or terms is a concept with a premise with a precise meaning expressed by one or more words. Okay? So exact synonyms represent the same term. So here's the example that I gave. Okay? If you say girl in English, or you say puella in Latin, are you talking about the same term?
Yes.
Yes, you're talking about a female human who is not of age, if you use the term girl, right? Has not gone through puberty yet or what have you. So we're talking, so this is a specific term, okay? Exact synonyms represent the same term. The English word girl and the Latin word puella represent the same term. They're the same. They're synonyms. They're talking about the same thing, okay? However, likewise, a single word can represent different words. So everybody go to page 3. And I want you to answer this question in the notes there. What does the word mad mean? So I want you to write down what you think the word mad means, because we're doing a little thought experiment here, okay? So in your notes, just briefly write down what the word mad means. Don't try to be a dictionary and give me every lexical definition that you can think of. Just write down what you think the word mad means.
One or?
Just one. Just the first thing that pops into your head. Okay? Mad is the word. All right, now, let's throw out some words, some definitions. What did you write down for what this word means, the word mad?
Emotionally upset.
Blake says emotionally upset. Okay? Any other definitions? Angry. Crazy.
I put crazy.
You put crazy.
Yeah.
Who else put something more along the lines of crazy? Okay? Got 4 of those. Anybody say anything else other than angry, emotionally disturbed? I guess those are similar. Frustrated. Okay? Negative. So look at the way we're defined. So all I've done is given you one word, and is everybody kind of coming up with their own meaning of that word? This is a very important thing that you guys get. Whenever you're dealing with somebody on a subject matter, one of the first things you must do is define your what? Terms. Because if we're talking about being mad, and 4 of you are thinking crazy, and 4 of you are thinking angry, are we working off of the same understanding of what the term means? Okay? So I just have here, mad can mean either angry or insane. If somebody's mad, well, maybe you mean they're angry, but you could mean they're what? Insane. Like they're crazy, they're insane. Depending on the context of how the word's being used. Yeah?
One more definition. It could be a mid-accusational.
Mad.
It's an acronym now.
Mid-ax dispensational. Yes, that's the way Joel would define it. Okay? But you understand, if you don't get to the bottom and define the term, are you going to have a fruitless conversation? Okay? Now I'm going to go here. I'm not being political. I'm using this as an example. Okay? I'm going to write this up here. And I want you to think about it. Abortion. How does the pro-life community define abortion? Murder. Why? Because it's taking a what? A life, an innocent life. Therefore it's murder, right? How does the pro-choice community define this term?
A medical procedure.
They say it's a woman's right to choose what she does with her own body. Right? That's the way they would define it, at least the way I've seen it defined, right? So now people go out into the arena, the public space, and they try to debate and discuss abortion, and the conversation never goes anywhere. Okay? In my mind, one of the reasons why the conversation doesn't go anywhere is because people aren't talking about the same what? They have not defined their terms. Okay? That's why it's important to always get somebody to define their what? Their terms. Else, you could be using the same words, but talking about very different what? Things. Okay? Any comments or questions before we move on?
Another term that you hear is reproductive health care.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a loaded term now too. There's a lot of terms that get loaded and used for specific agendas, I guess. Okay? So if you're going to deal with terms, then obviously it makes sense that the next thing you're going to have to deal with then is what? Definitions. How are you going to define these terms? Okay? So, definitions is a definition or definitions is a statement that gives meaning to a term. So when we define mad as being either angry or insane, are we bringing a definition to the term that we're going to now use in the conversation? Okay? So, lawyers, I gave you this quote here. Lawyers must continually define their terms. Okay? Many use precise technical language to do so. The same is true for teachers, scientists, philosophers, theologians, and many other professionals. Okay? So that's why when I'm working with Dave Reed on this book, The Myth of Verbatim Identicality, he comes up with, I was just using the phrase exact sameness to define what I was, to talk about sort of publicly what I was talking about. And he says, no, that's not good enough. We need to have a better term. So he comes up with the term verbatim identicality. Okay? Now, you laugh, and some people might laugh at that, but that's a good term. The reason it's a good term is because it is precisely what? Defined. Here's the definition. Okay? The definition of verbatim identicality. To define the term verbatim identicality, we rely on the following dictionary definitions for each word. Verbatim, word for word, using the exact same words in the original in the exact same words. So verbatim means you're using the exact words of what you are calling the original. Identical means being the same in identity, the very self-same. We define verbatim identicality to mean when the reading in a particular document or verse is word for word the very same as the reading in another document or verse. Verbatim identicality is Xeroxed identicality in that the two readings are word for word, letter for letter, punctuation mark for punctuation mark identical. Now the reason I'm using that as an example is it a definition, is an example of defining terms. So once you define the term, now can everybody move forward and say, okay, this is what they mean when they talk about VI or verbatim identicality. Okay? So there are at least 6 different types of definitions. All right? 6 purposes and 5 different types of definitions as we think about this. All right? So definitions show the relationship between terms. You saw this in the video, okay? Man is often defined as a rational animal. That's the definition that Plato gave, okay? What relationships does this definition imply? If you define man as a rational animal, what definitions? I'm not saying I agree with that definition. I'm just bringing it up for the purposes of discussion here. If we define man as a rational animal, what relationships does this imply? Other animals. What else?
All humans are the same.
It's implying that man is an animal, okay? Which, of course, I don't want to give away the next answer, but would that point towards a more creationist interpretation of man or a more evolutionary atheistic interpretation of man?
Well, it depends on what Socrates meant by animal.
Depends on what you meant by animal. In our day and age, if people hear that, what are they probably going to infer, whether correctly or incorrectly? Evolution. Okay? So you think about a statement like that, and is there a lot of relational inferences that are made if you're going to use a definition like that? So that's the point, right? Is that when you use a term and you define the term, depending on how you define the term, is it now going to entail relationships to other terms and other definitions? Okay? Any questions? So, definitions remove ambiguity is important. And this brings us to what the definition here, a lexical definition. Okay? A lexical definition is a definition that shows relationships or reduces ambiguity, providing a single established meaning of a term is called a lexical definition. So when we define verbatim identicality, like I just read from in the book, are we giving a lexical definition of a term that we coined? Okay? Now, I want you to think about the two examples at the bottom of the slide here. They're also in your notes. And maybe I want you to jot this down, maybe talk to your neighbor about it quick. How is the word love being used in the following statements? The first one is, I love pizza. And the second one is, love your enemies. So take a minute. How is the word love being used in those two statements? So you guys that are online, we got some group chatter going on here. All right, so anybody want to give it a gander here on what you wrote for I Love Pizza?
A feeling.
A feeling. So so if I say I love pizza, what am I saying about it?
I prefer to eat it. Satisfying.
I'm probably communicating that I just enjoy it, that I like it, that it brings me happiness, some sort of a feeling. Okay? I could be saying, but I tell my wife I love her.
Therefore she's pizza.
That should be an action.
Yeah.
So there's my point, which brings us to the next one, right? Love your enemies. How's love being used there?
To do well.
Respect.
Respect, to do well towards them, to not be mean to them, to not be intentionally rude or hateful towards them, right? So are we using the same word? Yeah. But is the word communicating different things in the way we're using the word? So if I say I love pizza, I probably just mean I like it a lot. Okay, it's probably what I mean. If I say to my wife, I love you, she hopes I'm not saying the same thing about her that I'm saying about the pizza. Right? She wants there to be something of deeper significance and meaning there, but are we using the same word to communicate that, right? So it's very important then that we understand the definition and the way that we're intending something to be used in the terms that we're choosing. Okay? So we also could think about that definitions, another thing definitions do is they reduce vagueness. Precising definitions seek to make more precise what is previously vague or fuzzy. Okay, so there's another little exercise for you. What's the difference between a tall person and a tall tree?
You can chop down a tree.
Can we please give examples that are not morbid? Thank you. No, seriously, what's the difference between a tall person and a tall tree? Because you use the word tall to describe a person, but you use the same word to describe a tree, and you probably don't exactly mean the same one. So, how tall is a tall person?
7 foot.
Okay, 7 foot.
Depends on who you're asking.
It depends. Okay,
That's
a fair point.
Don't look at me.
Depends, I suppose, on how vertically challenged you are. How
It
was a challenge.
No, but you're right. So for you, Amy, a 6 foot person would be tall, right? Culturally, how many of you think a 7 foot person would be tall? But we wouldn't call a 7 foot tree very tall. Probably. I mean, by tree standards, is a 7 foot tree a tall tree? No. Okay. So, like, the point is, you know, we use these terms, and so we're going to, a precising definition is a definition that is driving to the precise thing that you're trying to identify or that you're trying to discuss, okay? The other thing that definitions do is they increase your vocabulary, okay? Now, this is the question I want you to think about here is, what are some new words you've recently learned or heard being used? So you guys can just throw out some examples here. What are some new words that you've recently learned or heard being used? Hopefully appropriate words, but what are some words that you've recently heard are new to you that you now hear being used? Nobody has any.
Talking about generational.
Talking about any words, yeah.
Sigma.
Sigma?
Sick.
Sick. Like, you're not feeling well, or like, that's cool?
Some people say, oh, that's really sick, when it's like, they're saying it's cool.
Okay. Daniel, you used the word just the other day.
Just the other day, this dude said. What did I say?
I don't even, you were talking about something and you used the word, and I'm like, what does that mean? Oh, you were mad about something at work.
I don't know what I said, but I said I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, he used the word, and I'm like, what? And then he's got to like tell me what it means.
Yeah, David said he took.
Oh, I think I said like crash out or something.
Crash out, that's what it was.
Yeah.
So how did you use that phrase?
It's basically like I crashed out, like I got really upset and got super
Okay,
upset.
so if I use the expression or hear the expression crashed out being used, I usually think about like what I do after church on a Sunday and go take a nap. Crash out. Okay, go to sleep or something like that, right? He's using it to describe being mad at somebody for what he perceives was, not fair treatment, right? So definitions can reduce vagueness. So when he says, "Oh, I crashed out on those guys," I'm like, "What?" I'm like, "You fell asleep in the burger meat? Like, what happened?"
Millennial speech.
Okay, but my point is, was there vagueness in how he was using the word?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I needed to have the vagueness removed so I could understand what it was he was trying to say, right? Now I know that word, crash out, can increase my vocabulary. So now I can be talking to high schoolers and be like, "Oh, dude, you crashed out." And then they'll be like, "Man, this guy knows what he's talking about." Stop. But we could call that a stipulative definition, right? When a new word is invented or an existing word is applied in a new way. I think you could argue that that's what we did in the book with coining the term verbatim identicality. We are coining a new word, phrase, increasing vocabulary, reducing vagueness. The definition is doing all of those things as we think about discussion of that particular topic. Okay? Moving on. Definitions can explain concepts theoretically. So what is H2O? You know it as water. But what is if you're going to explain it to me scientifically, what is it?
Dihydrogen oxide.
Dihydrogen oxide. 2 hydrogen combined with 1 what? Oxygen. And we know that makes molecularly, what does that make? Water. So somebody says, "I want some H2O," you know they mean what? Water. Okay, so you have a word that's being used. So the definition can explain the concept theoretically. So if H2O is a scientific expression to capture something that is happening at a molecular level, right? So if I reach for my water and I drink it, am I consuming H2O?
Plus plastic.
Yeah, plus plastic polymers or whatever's there. Okay. So that's a theoretical definition. That's accepting a theory about the term being defined. Now, this is an important concept. If you accept a theoretical definition, you accept the theory behind it. You got to be careful. Okay? If you accept the definition of a man as an evolved ape, You're accepting the theory of what? So if somebody defines a human or a man as an evolved ape, I cannot accept that definition, because if I accept that definition, am I accepting the theory behind that definition? So for me, then, I'm not going to, if I'm engaging now in a dialogue with somebody and I ask them, how are you defining a man? And they say they're defining it as an evolved ape, I'm not going to accept that definition. Because in accepting that definition, am I also accepting the theory behind it? Does that make sense? Okay?
Now, this is where abortion comes in.
Yeah.
Correct, and that's in the notes.
Because it is solved in the Bible.
It's solved, I would argue, also scientifically.
Not scientific. I mean, scientifically, they call it fetus.
Well,
God calls it child.
Who calls it fetus?
Yeah, who does that?
Scientific, don't they call it fetus?
I would say life begins at conception.
But what does the term fetus mean? It's a Latin term.
I don't actually know what it means.
It means little one or child.
Okay.
Oh, is that what it means? Okay.
So where are you going with that, Nate? Just to...
Well, that's where the importance of defining terms comes up, because even if the scientific community calls it fetus, what's the term? The term fetus means small child or little one. So even if you call it a fetus and say, well, then it's fine to kill it, well, no, the term's still a child. So you're still saying, we're killing a child.
I don't know that they even call it fetus anymore.
I don't think they do.
Right, because we brought that up eventually and said, you know, you're still calling it a baby, just in another language.
Exactly.
Yeah, clump of cells now they define it.
Which implies life as well. If it's a cell,
If it's
it
cells,
multiplies and it's life. So.
Right.
We're all clumps of cells too, we're just larger.
Right.
So that brings us to the last this point. Definitions can obviously then influence attitudes, right? Which is the last point here. So we've already kind of done this, but how would you I jumped the gun a little bit on the abortion example, but so then we get into persuasive definitions. This is important too. Definitions aimed at persuading a listener one way or the other toward the term being defined. So you can make an argument here for the whole thing was, well, what is a woman? And the way the political left is trying to redefine what that means, right? They're doing it because they're trying to persuade people to think certain what? Certain ways, certain things. So do terms and how you define terms really have a lot of rhetorical force and manipulative power in setting one argument against another and affecting the people's thoughts and attitudes about what you're proposing and asking them to embrace. Okay? You could argue that it is a form of propaganda. So we got 5 minutes left, so we got just enough time to cover this last slide. So definitions give meaning for terms. Definitions can show relationships between terms, remove ambiguity, reduce vagueness, increase vocabulary, explain concepts theoretically, and influence attitudes. Along with these purposes, are 5 types of definitions: lexical, precising, stipulative, theoretical, and persuasive. Okay? And I've got sort of just 2 points here to end on, and that's this. Defining terms is one of the most important things you can do when engaging in a dialogue with somebody. You cannot overemphasize the importance of defining your terms with people. Okay, somebody comes to you and they raise a matter with you, and you have to say, well, what do you mean by that? You use that word. How are you defining that word? How are you using that word? And then once you have an understanding from them of how they're using the word, if you perceive that they alter the meaning at some point in the conversation, now can you point it out to them? Wait a minute, you're now using that word different from the way that you defined the way that you were using it. Okay? This is critically important that people realize the importance of defining terms and what they're talking about when they engage people in conversations. Particularly conversations about the faith, the scriptures, etc. And I got one more here, which I think is also important. Do not accept someone else's premise until they have adequately defined their terms. Don't accept their premise or grant them the premise until you have forced them to define what they mean and how they are using that word or that concept or that phrase or whatever. Okay? Because if you don't, could you literally be talking past each other and wasting your time? Okay? We got a few minutes. Does anybody have any comments or questions?
The issue of words and terms and the difference between a word and a term and that relationship is extremely important when you start reading your Bible. You know, things like the word saved or salvation. What does that mean when we encounter it in the Bible? It's not always the same term. 51% of the time in the New Testament, when you see save or sozo or salvation, soterion, they 51% of the time do not have anything to do with justification before God spiritually. 51% of the time they are physical deliverance or things like that. So if you don't recognize terms and words and the difference, and I read save or salvation every time as justified before God, am I going to come to some really bad doctrine?
Yes.
Yeah. It happens all the time. So you get, and that's where rules of context now come in too, right? Context helps you determine how a term is being used in a given context, right? Trying to think of a quick example off the top of my head. Baptism, gospel. Give 1 Corinthians 15. And while you find that, you'll notice page 5. Page 5, we're going to give you page 5. This is a practice page for you to take the concepts that we covered in this lesson and do a little bit of practice with those concepts to try to maybe embed them a little bit further into your understanding, okay? Maybe we'll go over some of those answers at the beginning of the next class. That might not be a bad thing to make everyone do their homework, eh?
Yeah, tell them to come find us early.
Pass the quiz.
And we'll give a prize.
I was just going to say, when I get the full points, we'll be good.
Yeah.
I got Jolly Ranchers. I got candy right here. You can have some of this. All right. Look at 1 Corinthians 15 quick. Notice verse 1. How much time do I have? No, I'm already over. Dang it. Moreover, brethren, I declare unto you the gospel which I preached unto you, which also ye have received, and wherein ye stand, by which ye are saved, if ye keep in memory what I preached unto you. Okay? So by the way, by the time you get to 1 Corinthians 15, he's writing to Corinthians, are they already saved? Does he call them brethren in verse 1? Okay? So the saved, what are they saved from if they keep in memory here? Okay? If you say that this is justification, initial justification for salvation, now you are putting a condition upon somebody keeping this in memory in order to be what? Saved. But what the context, we don't have time to study it. I've got other lessons online where I cover this. The salvation here, the context, if you read the rest of 1 Corinthians, is about being saved from the hopelessness of despair if there is no resurrection. Because had some of the Corinthians embraced the idea that there is no resurrection? Yes, they had. How do I know that? Go to verse 11. Therefore, whether it were I or they, so we preach and so ye believe. Look at verse 12. Now if Christ be preached that he rose from the dead, how say some among you that there is no what? So the salvation in the context is not about salvation from sin or justification. The salvation in the context is being saved from the hopelessness of despair of believing that there's no what? Resurrection. So saved has a context here, and it has a meaning in the context. And that's basically what Nate's point was, I believe, right? Okay, so next Sunday we are not going to have class. It's a holiday weekend. I'm going to be out of town. It's Memorial Day weekend, Blake. You looked at me like I had 6 heads. Next Sunday we will not have class. I will be out of town. Nate has something he has to do next Sunday. So we will be back in class on June 1. Okay, June 1 will be the next class in this series. Appreciate everyone's attention. I apologize for the first 20 minutes or so being a little bit clunky with the tech, fighting with the technology. So thanks for coming, and we'll see you guys next time. Yep.